Drive northwest out of Arco, Idaho, and the scenery gives up on you almost immediately. Sagebrush, black rock. A horizon so flat and so patient that it starts to feel like a practical joke at your expense. And somewhere out there, on a wide gray apron of gravel, the big lost river ends. Not into a lake, not into a delta. There's no dam, no reservoir, no little brown sign explaining any of it. In a good snow year, the water comes down out of the Pioneer Mountains, crosses roughly 130 miles of valley, spreads across a shallow basin, thins, slows, and goes into the ground. That's the whole ending. The place is called the Big Lost River Sinks, which has to be one of the most honest names anybody has ever put on an American map. A few miles east, the Little Lost River does the same thing. Farther north, Birch Creek does it too. 3 real rivers, with real fish and real irrigation ditches taken off them, all walking into the desert and quitting. Now the part that makes this more than a curiosity, that water doesn't evaporate and it doesn't vanish. About 100 miles away, on the other side of the plain, water comes blasting out of a basalt cliff above the Snake River near a town called Hagerman. Not a trickle down a rock face. Thousands of cubic feet per second coming out of the middle of a canyon wall, in volumes that would qualify as a respectable river anywhere else in the country. It arrives at 58 degrees Fahrenheit in February and 58 degrees in August, year after year. And it has been doing that since long before anybody wrote it down. Between those two places, under the potato fields and the interstate, and the little towns with 1 grain elevator each, there is a body of water holding somewhere between 200 and 300 million acre-feet, which is a number that means nothing to a normal human being. So try it this way. Take Lake Erie, all of it. Pour it into cracked lava rock underneath southern Idaho, and you're roughly in the neighborhood. That's the Eastern Snake River Plain Aquifer. It's the largest thing in Idaho by a wide margin, and you cannot see 1 drop of it from the road. And since about the middle of the last century, it has been getting smaller. That's the story. Not a mystery in the spooky sense, because hydrologists have been mapping this thing with dye and drill rigs and water level records for 100 years. The strange part is that a state built an entire agricultural economy, plus the oldest nuclear research complex in the country, on top of a plumbing system most people living there have never had a reason to think about, and now the bill has arrived, and somebody has to decide who pays it. So let's follow the water, all the way across. To understand why this aquifer behaves the way it does, you have to understand that the Snake River Plain is not a normal valley. Normal valleys get carved by rivers or dropped between fault blocks. This one got made from underneath. Starting around 16 million years ago, the North American plate began sliding southwest over a persistent source of heat in the mantle. The heat stayed put. The continent moved. And as it moved, it left a track of enormous volcanic centers behind it, stepping northeast across Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho like footprints pressed into wet cement. The plate crawls along at a couple of centimeters a year, which is roughly the speed your fingernails grow. And given 16 million years, even fingernail speed adds up to a scar 600 miles long. That's the origin of the plain. Each of those old volcanic centers erupted enormous volumes of rhyolite, collapsed into a caldera, cooled, cracked, and then slowly sagged as the crust beneath it lost its heat. The result was a long, subsiding trough. And a long, subsiding trough in a volcanic province gets filled with exactly one thing: basalt, layer after layer of it. For the last few million years, runny basalt lava poured out of vents and fissures along the plain and spread out in thin sheets. Not the explosive, mountain-building kind of eruption, the boring kind. The kind that comes out at a walking pace, floods a low spot, cools, and waits a few thousand years to do it again. Individual flows tend to be 20 to 30 feet thick, Stack up enough of them, and in places you have close to a mile of basalt sitting on top of the buried volcanic record. Here's why that matters more than any other fact in this story. When a lava flow moves, the top skin cools first and crusts over while the inside is still liquid. That crust breaks up. The advancing front tumbles blocks forward and then runs them over. As the flow cools all the way through, it shrinks and fractures into columns and joints. And when the lava drains out of the middle of a well-insulated flow, it leaves a tube behind. So every one of those flows ends up with dense, tight rock in the middle and a mess of broken rubble at the top and bottom. Stack a few hundred of them, and what you've built is barely a rock formation in the way most people picture one. It's a warehouse full of shattered pipes, with the rubble zones between flows acting as horizontal highways for water. Compare that to a classic sandstone aquifer, where water squeezes between sand grains at the pace of a determined snail. Water in the Snake River Plain basalt can move hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet in a single day. Wells yielding 3,000 gallons a minute are not considered remarkable. In much of the world, that would be the best well anyone had ever drilled. On the Snake River Plain, it's Tuesday, and that porous, thirsty rock explains the vanishing rivers immediately. When the big lost river hits the edge of the plain, it's running onto a floor of broken lava with the drainage characteristics of a colander. The river doesn't get stopped, it gets absorbed. There's one more piece of the surface, and it came fast. Somewhere around 18,000 years ago, give or take, an enormous lake sat in what is now Utah. Lake Bonneville, the ancestor of the Great Salt Lake, and much, much bigger. At its northern edge, it was held back by a threshold of loose sediment at Red Rock Pass. That threshold failed. What followed was one of the largest floods in the geologic record of North America. Water tore north through the Marsh Creek Valley, swung west, and ran the length of the Snake River Plain. It scoured basalt off the bedrock and rolled boulders the size of delivery vans for miles, leaving them scattered in fields that early geologists named melon gravel, because that's what they looked like, assuming you're the kind of person who thinks in produce. And critically for this story, the flood deepened and widened the Snake River Canyon through the Twin Falls and Hagerman Stretch. That cut is the doorway. Without a canyon slicing down through the layered basalt, all that groundwater would still be moving west, but it would have nowhere to come out. The flood opened a wound in the side of the aquifer, and the aquifer has been bleeding water into the Snake River ever since. Which raises the obvious question: how does anyone actually know that water from the sinks near Arco ends up in a canyon wall 100 miles away? That's a big claim to make about something nobody can see. The answer is that they measured it in about 4 different ways over about a century. The first tool is dull and enormously powerful. Drill enough wells, measure the depth to water in all of them, and you can draw a map of the water table the same way you'd draw a topographic map of hills. Do that across the eastern plain, and the picture isn't ambiguous at all. The water surface is high on the northeast, near the mountains and the sinking rivers, and it slopes steadily down toward the southwest. Groundwater flows downhill, just like everything else, and the gradient points from Arco toward the Snake River Canyon in every survey anybody has run. The second tool is chemistry. Water picks up a fingerprint from the rock it travels through, and different tributary basins on the north side of the plain have measurably different signatures. Those signatures show up down gradient, in the right order, in the right places. The third tool is the fun one. You put dye in the water and go wait for it. Since 2008, researchers working with the Idaho Department of Water Resources and university partners have run more than 24 fluorescent dye tracer tests across the eastern plain, injecting dye at recharge sites and near-known spring systems, then sampling wells and springs downstream for weeks or months afterward. The results consistently document groundwater velocities ranging from a few hundred feet per day to several thousand feet per day. and the water speeds up as it approaches the spring areas where the gradient steepens. In one test, dye injected at a recharge site turned up in domestic wells a little over 3 miles away, moving at a maximum rate of roughly 1,800 feet per day. Those are the express lanes. Fractures and rubble zones and old lava tubes lined up favorably. Most of the water isn't traveling anywhere near that fast. For the full crossing, the estimates get long. A drop of water entering the aquifer up on the northeastern end of the plain generally takes something on the order of 150 to 200 years to make it all the way through the system to the discharge area, and some estimates stretch that to 2 or 3 centuries. Water sitting in the deeper, slower parts of the system can be far older than that, which is hard to hold in your head, so here's the mundane version. The water leaving the Big Lost River sinks this spring will not come out of that canyon wall in your lifetime. It's mail with a delivery window measured in generations, and the water pouring out at the other end right now was put into the ground by weather that happened when the plain was mostly bunch grass and nobody had drilled a well in it. Enormous, slow, and almost entirely indifferent to the pace at which human beings make decisions. So the far end of the pipe, which is honestly the reason anybody outside Idaho has ever heard of any of this. Below Twin Falls, the Snake River runs through a canyon several hundred feet deep. And along a stretch of that canyon between roughly Twin Falls and the town of Bliss, the aquifer meets the cut and comes out. It comes out of the rock face, not down at the bottom of the canyon where you'd expect a spring to be, but out of the wall, partway up, where a permeable rubble zone between 2 lava flows has been sliced open. Water arrives at that opening, finds nothing holding it back, and exits into daylight. The whole stretch is called Thousand Springs, and it earns the name. This reach contains 11 of the 65 largest springs in the United States. Box Canyon Springs, at the head of a short side canyon, discharges around 180,000 gallons a minute straight out of the ground, which puts it among the largest springs in North America. It doesn't build up from a watershed. It starts at full size, immediately, as a river that emerges from a hillside already fully formed. Add up the springs along the Thousand Springs Reach, and the combined discharge has historically run in the range of 5,000 cubic feet per second. That's more water than plenty of rivers with names, states, and bridge dedications carry on an average day. It is a major American river with no headwaters, no drainage basin of its own, no tributaries, and no upstream. It has a wall, and the temperature never moves. Because that water has been underground for decades or centuries, it has completely forgotten what season it is. It comes out at close to 58 or 59 degrees Fahrenheit in January, and at close to the same temperature in July. It doesn't freeze, it doesn't flood, it doesn't run muddy after a storm. Hand a group of people a flat volcanic plain with a long growing season, enormous quantities of shallow groundwater underneath it, and 100 miles of constant temperature spring water at the western end, and you'd expect them to use every bit of it. They did. Start with the obvious one. Southern Idaho grows food at a scale that most Americans have eaten from without ever thinking about it. Something close to a third of the potatoes grown in the United States come off the Snake River Plain. Sugar beets, malt barley, wheat, alfalfa, beans, and the dairy herds that go with the alfalfa. Millions of irrigated acres, roughly split between farms taking surface water from the Snake River and its canals, and farms pumping directly out of the aquifer. Around 300,000 people, something like 1 in 6 Idahoans, drink from it. Then there's the industry that only exists because of the temperature. Rainbow trout are particular about water. They want it cold, clean, well oxygenated, and above all, steady. A hatchery on a normal river spends its year fighting seasonal swings, silt, and flood events. A hatchery fed by a spring that arrives at 58 degrees every day of the year has no such problems. So the Hagerman and Boole area, a modest stretch of canyon country with a small population and not much else going on, became the trout capital of the United States. Idaho produces on the order of 70% of the farm-raised rainbow trout in the country, almost all of it clustered around those springs. If you have eaten farmed American trout, there's a strong chance it grew up in water that fell as snow on the mountains northeast of Idaho Falls before the Second World War, sank into a lava plain, spent a century underground, and came out of a cliff. And then there's the one that makes people sit up. In 1949, the Atomic Energy Commission went looking for somewhere to build and test nuclear reactors. They wanted flat ground, low population, and enough space that if an experiment went badly, nobody outside the fence would be affected. They chose the desert northwest of Idaho Falls and established what was then called the National Reactor Testing Station. Today it's the Idaho National Laboratory, around 890 square miles of high desert, roughly the size of Rhode Island. 52 reactors have been built there over the years, more than at any other single location on Earth. In December of 1951, a small experimental breeder reactor on that site produced the first usable electricity ever generated from nuclear fission. 4 light bulbs. It's a museum now. And the entire complex sits on top of the aquifer. The big Lost River sinks are on lab property. The water that vanishes there travels underneath those facilities on its way southwest. This next part needs care and specifics, because it's the kind of fact that gets shouted about badly. In the early decades of that site, from the 1950s onward, wastewater from operations was disposed of in ways that were standard practice at the time and would not be permitted today, including injection into the subsurface and discharge to unlined ponds. Contaminants did reach the aquifer. That isn't a rumor or an allegation. It's documented at length by the United States Geological Survey, which has maintained groundwater monitoring networks at the site in cooperation with the Department of Energy for decades, sampling scores of wells on a regular schedule and publishing the results. What those reports show is a set of well-mapped plumes containing tritium, strontium-90, and iodine-129, largely contained within the lab's boundary, tracked well by well, and they show something else worth saying out loud. Across most of the monitoring wells inside those plumes, concentrations of those contaminants have been declining over the past couple of decades. As disposal practices changed, as short-lived isotopes decayed, and as the enormous volume of moving groundwater diluted what was there. That's the honest version. A serious contamination history actively monitored, generally improving, in an aquifer whose sheer size and speed have done a great deal of the work. The reason the monitoring matters so much is the same reason the trout farms exist and the potato fields exist. Everything on this plain shares one body of water, and that body of water moves in one direction toward the springs, toward the river, toward the towns downstream, which is exactly why the next part became such a problem. For the first half of the 20th century, the aquifer was gaining. That sounds backwards, so here's the mechanism. When settlers built the great canal systems off the Snake River in the 1890s and early 1900s, they irrigated by flooding. Water ran down unlined dirt canals, spilled out into furrows, soaked the fields, and a large share of it kept right on going down past the roots and into the basalt. Southern Idaho was, without intending to, running the largest artificial recharge program in the American West. The numbers are striking. Between about 1912 and 1952, storage in the aquifer increased by something like 17 million acre-feet. The water table rose across large parts of the plain, in some areas by 60 or 70 feet. And because the aquifer was fuller, more water pushed out at the discharge end. Spring flow in the Thousand Springs Reach climbed from around 4,800 cubic feet per second in 1915 to roughly 6,800 cubic feet per second by the mid-1950s. An entire ecosystem, an entire fish farming industry, and an entire set of legal water rights got established during that swell. People built businesses around spring flows that were, in part, a side effect of leaky irrigation. Then two things changed at once. Pumps got better and cheaper, and rural electrification reached the farms. Land that had been too high or too far from a canal could now be irrigated by pulling water straight out of the ground. Groundwater irrigated acreage expanded enormously through the middle of the century, and irrigation got efficient. Center pivot sprinklers replaced flood irrigation across huge areas. Canals were lined. Delivery losses were cut. Farmers did what everyone had been telling them to do for 50 years, which was to stop wasting water. Both changes pushed the same direction. More water taken out, far less water leaking back in. Roughly 60% of the recharge feeding this aquifer had been coming from applied irrigation water, and the plain got dramatically better at not losing any. Since about 1952, the aquifer has been losing storage at a rate on the order of 215,000 acre-feet a year. And the springs answered, the way they always do, after a delay. Spring discharge in the Thousand Springs Reach came off its 1950s peak and declined substantially. Trout farms that had been designed around a certain flow found themselves with less. Some smaller springs that people had built around went quiet. There's a hard idea buried in that sequence, and I think it's the most interesting thing on this whole plain. Efficiency, applied to a system where the waste was feeding something else, doesn't produce a free saving. It moves the loss somewhere less visible. The water that used to seep past the potato roots was never lost. It was in transit on a 150-year trip to a canyon wall. Stop the seepage, and the canyon wall finds out, eventually, whether anyone is paying attention or not. Nobody planned that. And under Idaho water law, nobody had to think about it for a long time because the law treated rivers and groundwater as separate things. Idaho, like most of the West, runs on prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. The oldest water right on a source gets satisfied first, and in a short year, the newest rights get shut off. It's a brutal, clear system, and it works fine as long as everyone is drinking from the same clearly defined bucket. The canal companies along the Snake River hold some of the oldest rights in the state, going back into the 1890s. The groundwater pumpers out on the plain, mostly, hold much newer ones. And once hydrologists established what the dye and the water tables had been saying all along, that pumping from the aquifer reduces flow to the springs and the river, and therefore reduces what reaches the senior canal companies downstream, the two groups stopped being separate. The mechanism is real but slow and diffuse, which is what makes it so legally miserable. A pump running near Idaho Falls in July does not take water from a canal company in Twin Falls that afternoon. It changes a pressure surface, and that change propagates through the basalt over years. The effect is genuine and modelable, and completely invisible on any given day to the person operating the pump. The senior surface users made a delivery call, the formal demand that the state protect their older rights. Idaho began what's known as conjunctive management, administering surface water and groundwater as one connected resource. And then came 15 years of hydrologic modeling, hearings, appeals, and negotiation that I will spare you. In 2015, after a curtailment order that could have shut off a large number of wells, the parties settled. The groundwater districts agreed to cut their net consumption by 240,000 acre-feet a year through a mix of conversions to surface water, reduced acreage, and and other measures. The state committed to a managed recharge program, deliberately diverting high spring flows into canals and infiltration basins to put water back into the basalt on purpose, with a target averaging 250,000 acre-feet a year. In exchange, complying groundwater users got protection from being shut off. For a while it held, then a run of dry years, and disputes about whether the reduction targets were actually being met brought the whole thing back to a boil. On the 30th of May, 2024, the director of the Idaho Department of Water Resources issued a curtailment order. It affected roughly 6,400 junior groundwater rights. It covered something on the order of 500,000 acres of farmland across eastern Idaho and the Magic Valley. The triggering calculation was a projected shortfall of about 74,100 acre-feet to one canal company, and the order landed in late May, which is precisely the moment when a potato crop is in the ground and utterly dependent on what happens next. The reaction was about what you would expect when a state agency tells 500,000 acres of planted farmland that the water may stop. Emergency meetings, editorials calling the order irresponsible, hard words between neighbors, lawyers everywhere, and a lot of people doing arithmetic about whether their operation survives the year. These are working farms, many of them family operations several generations deep, and the number attached to a shutoff order is somebody's entire year. The curtailment was never fully carried out. 3 weeks later, on the 20th of June, the state approved a negotiated in-season agreement in which the groundwater districts collectively conserved 240,000 acre-feet and delivered 50,000 acre-feet of stored water to the surface users. The wells kept running, but everyone involved understood that a rescue negotiated 3 weeks after planting is no kind of system. It's a fire drill, so they built something longer. In November of 2024, the groundwater districts and the Surface Water Coalition finalized a new mitigation plan. Under it, the participating groundwater districts conserve 205,000 acre-feet a year, averaged across a 4-year term so that one freak season doesn't blow up the whole arrangement, and they supply up to 75,000 acre-feet of stored water for direct mitigation when it's needed. In return, they get protection from the delivery call as long as they comply. The plan gets reviewed in the fall of 2027 with the option to renew. Alongside it, the state went considerably harder on the recharge side. Managed aquifer recharge in Idaho is exactly what it sounds like. When the Snake River is running high in winter and early spring, water that would otherwise leave the state gets pushed into canals and spread across basins over permeable ground, where it sinks into the basalt and does deliberately what leaky flood irrigation used to do by accident. In 2025, the legislature raised the state's annual average recharge goal by 40%, from 250,000 acre-feet to 350,000, measured on a 15-year rolling average, and attached an ongoing $30 million annual appropriation to help water users meet the settlement terms. Through 2026, the Water Board has kept approving new recharge basins, several $million at a time, which is where it stands now, and where the whole 100-year arc gets tested. The winter of 2026 was extraordinarily warm. By the 1st of April, snowpack across Idaho was the lowest on record, with dozens of measuring sites throughout the Snake River Basin, each reporting record low snow water equivalent. Snowmelt started in the middle of March, including at elevations above 10,000 feet, where the snow usually sits for another month. On the 13th of April, the state declared a drought emergency covering all 44 Idaho counties. Then the water year did its arithmetic. The projected shortfall to the senior surface users for the 2026 irrigation season came in at about 181,600 acre-feet. And the curtailment order the department issued in mid-April carried a priority date of 1900, read that the way a water lawyer would. A curtailment date that early means essentially every groundwater right on the plain is on the hook for mitigation, including rights older than most of the towns out there. The canal companies cut their own deliveries first. Twin Falls Canal Company reduced allocations by a third. Others cut by a fifth. Reservoir storage came into the season roughly a third below normal. Farmers started making the only decision available to them, which is choosing which fields to keep alive and which ones to let go. And because the river simply wasn't running high, there was no surplus water to divert into the recharge basins. The one tool designed to put water back was, in the year it was most needed, holding an empty bucket. Take the whole thing at once from a distance. 16 million years of volcanism built a trough and filled it with broken rock. A vanished Ice Age lake cut a doorway into the western end of it. 3 rivers on the northeastern edge walk into the desert and hand their water to the basalt, which carries it southwest for a century or two and lets it out of a cliff face at 58 degrees. On top of that plumbing, in about 120 years, people built a third of the nation's potato crop, most of it's farmed trout, drinking water for 300,000 residents, and the country's oldest nuclear research complex. For 50 years, their leaky canals accidentally made the aquifer bigger. For the 70 years since, their improvements have been making it smaller. And nobody in this story is the villain. The canal builders who flooded their fields weren't wasting water on purpose. The farmers who installed pivots were doing conservation correctly, with everyone's approval. The engineers who sited a reactor testing station in an empty desert in 1949 were following the best practice of 1949. Every single decision that produced the current situation was reasonable at the time it was made, and the aquifer added them all up over a timescale nobody was thinking in. Which is why the ending isn't geological. The rock is going to keep doing what basalt does. The springs will discharge whatever the aquifer's pressure tells them to discharge, with a delay of decades, and they will not be negotiating. The decision is entirely human, and it's being made right now, in rooms with folding chairs and bad coffee. Groundwater district boards deciding how many acres come out of production and whose. Canal company boards deciding how thin to slice an allocation. A state agency director signing orders that determine which farms get water in July. A legislature deciding whether $30 million a year for recharge is a serious commitment or a down payment. And several thousand individual farmers in February looking at a snowpack report and deciding what to plant, knowing that a wrong guess costs them the year. That's the thing Idaho is actually hiding, not a secret. An accounting problem the size of Lake Erie, held in rock, moving at the speed of a century, being settled in annual installments by people who will not live long enough to see whether they got it right. Go back out to that gravel flat northwest of Arco, where the big lost river ends. It looks like a failure. A river that couldn't finish. That gravel is the intake. That's where the largest reservoir in Idaho gets filled, one absorbed river at a time. And the state is now spending real money trying to do on purpose what that riverbed has been doing for free since long before anyone showed up to name it. One thing to take with you, because it's the question this whole plane is really asking. When the waste in a system turns out to be feeding something else downstream, who carries the cost of fixing it? The farmer who stopped the leak and did exactly what he was told? Or the people living on what leaked? Idaho has been answering that in acre feet for 15 years and still hates the answer. Tell me how you'd answer it. And if you like the idea of a channel that goes looking for the enormous thing underneath the boring landscape, the like button and the subscribe button cost you considerably less than an acre foot.